All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for stopping by Brian for Liberty once again. I certainly appreciate your time. I know we've all got busy schedules. I certainly appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to stop by here and spend some time with me. Today, we're going to be talking about a pretty serious topic. I know that it's on everybody's mind. It is what is going on in the country right now. And the argument that's coming out of this as the riots and the looting and things of that nature start to settle down, finally, we're really starting to have what I think is better conversations and more dialogue around what is the issue. And what I'm seeing is a lot of conversation between liberals and conservatives arguing whether or not the system itself is, in fact, systemically racist. Is our system, as it exists, designed to oppress black people? I look at this as, from a libertarian perspective, as authoritarian government is always designed to oppress people by its nature. It's designed to hold back your freedoms. It's designed to control certain aspects of your behavior. To me, that is oppression. If this is your first time stopping by my channel and you're not familiar with libertarians and libertarianism and the philosophy itself, it's pretty simple. Libertarians simply believe that you should be free to live your life as you see fit, that your liberty should not be impeded as long as you are respecting everybody else's ability to do the same. We have to look at what happens with totalitarian governments when authoritarian governments grow and become corrupt. What happens in those scenarios is that the most vulnerable members of a community are the first ones to be impacted. The black people in this country are not being oppressed by a system designed to oppress them, in my opinion, but they are the canary in the coal mine. This is a warning to the rest of the nation as to what's coming if we don't change things. There are specific systems, there are specific laws that have had an adverse and negative impact on blacks in this country, and we need to address those, because it's coming for the rest of you as well. And not only that, but if you believe in freedom and prosperity, if you're a Second Amendment, Trump-supporting, small government, I believe in freedom person, if you're the kind of person who's going to take his AR-15 to the state capitol and have a protest, then you should also be the kind of person who looks at your government and says, why are you oppressing all these people? Why is there the mass incarceration of a single race? So I'm not 100% sure where you guys are, but you shouldn't just be out protesting when they're trampling your rights. You should be out protesting when they're trampling anybody's rights. And the mass incarceration of a single race in this country is a pretty dangerous thing that we should all be taking a look at together. So the argument of systemic racism, I don't know if that's something we're going to be able to put at rest. It's something I have been struggling with myself. And when I think about systemic racism in that argument, the people who hold that up are going to point to certain things like Jim Crow and slavery and redlining and all these horrible things that our country has done in the past to black people. And when I say there's no systemic racism, I'm saying that we don't live under those things anymore. It's been 56 years since we passed the Civil Rights Act, since those practices not only were eliminated, but declared illegal by our federal government. So I don't believe we're living under those oppressive, systemically racist. I know we're not living under those systemically racist issues anymore. But when somebody says that the country isn't systemically racist, I've heard this argument over and over and over again. It goes the same way every time. The country's not systemically racist. Oh yeah? They point to the mass incarceration of blacks, the over-policing of black communities. The person on the other side of that argument immediately says, well, blacks are committing more crime, and that's why this is happening. The next question, the very next thing that comes out of your mouth should not be, it's because they're over-policed, because now you're getting circular. Ask them the question. Ask them to answer why. Why are black people committing so much crime? Why are black people so much more involved in the murder rate? Why are black people so much more representative in violent crime? Ask them that question, because they had better have a really good answer. Otherwise, there's only two answers. Otherwise, they're just racist. You see, when you fight them, you get to hide that. This should be, if you are saying that the country is not systemically racist, the answer to the question of what is going on in the black community should be incredibly uncomfortable for that person. And they had better have some historical perspective, and they had better have a good way to answer that question. Otherwise, they're essentially just saying that they're racist. Because black people, clearly, if there's not a historical reason for it, then black people are just prone to this kind of behavior. I think that's a disgusting attitude that none of us would support. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, at the end of the civil rights movement, why haven't black people been able to take advantage of the massive momentum they gained at the end of the civil rights movement. And this is where we have to start having some historical perspective. When you look back at Jim Crow, and I don't necessarily go back as far as slavery in this particular video, although slavery does still play a role in how the black man was emasculated and how the black families were broken up, particularly in the United States during slavery. And you could read that in the Moynihan report. I'm going to touch on a little bit later. But when we look at Jim Crow and we look at this horrible legacy of racism in this country, this isn't something that my great-grandfather went through. This isn't something that my grandfather went through. My father would not have been allowed to use the same water fountain as your father. Think about that for a minute. Think about, this isn't ancient history. Sometimes we talk about this stuff like it was centuries ago. No, this just happened. The Civil Rights Act was passed just 11 years before I was born. So this is right in the rearview mirror. And so you could say we need to move on and get past it and not talk about it anymore, but we certainly have to talk about the fact that coming out of the Civil Rights Act, the African-American community would have been at a massive economic disadvantage to the white man. It's an inarguable fact. You can't look back on our history and say that, we passed the Civil Rights Act, and so now everything should be okay. Well, of course not. Of course the African-American community was going to be at an extreme disadvantage. And so we have to look at the policies and what our government did in that short 10, 15, 20-year period right after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So to me, one of the first things we should look at is the Moynihan Report. And this was a book written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the Assistant Secretary of Labor under Lyndon Johnson. And he wrote a book called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. Mr. Moynihan's report did not necessarily print a flattering picture of what was going on in the black community at the time, but it wasn't necessarily inaccurate either. He didn't lay the blame for what was going on at the feet of the black community only. Based on the legacy of slavery in our country, in the United States of America, slavery here was particularly brutal when compared to slavery in other places. But in, for example, South America, black slaves in South America were actually treated as people. And we didn't treat black slaves as people in the United States. We treated them as less than human. And because of that, a terrible legacy was left. We broke up families, whereas in South America, black slaves were actually allowed to marry. They were allowed to work towards their freedom. Black families were typically kept together. That wasn't the case with American slavery. So entering the Jim Crow era, the black family was already heavily weakened by the atrocities of our slave history. Coming out of Jim Crow and into the modern era, essentially, the black non-marital birth rate was already at 24% compared with 3% amongst whites. This is a legacy of slavery. It's inarguable at that point that this is a legacy of slavery. We spent centuries breaking up black families. The fact that they were holding on to that low of a non-marital birth rate, which, by the way, is pretty much in line with white America today. So when I say that our bad policies are coming for you next, that's what I mean. But at that time, the black community had about a 24% non-marital birth rate compared to only 3% in the white community. And looking at the legacy of slavery and looking at the legacy of Jim Crow, Mr. Moynihan pointed out that if the black community is not going to be able to capture economic equality with white America unless further action is taken. Now, this report caught the attention of President Johnson, and he actually gave a speech about it at Howard University. But here's what happened. The conservatives of the era took the report and laid the blame at the feet of the black. They used it to say black people have loose family values, they have poor morals, whatever the case may be. Racist conservatives of the time were saying that. On the flip side, black people and the black community and black leaders called the report racist. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like an argument we're still having in this country? That we lay the blame for legacy issues at the feet of black America, and that any attempt to address real issues within the black community are called racist. We're having the same fight, and it started right then and there. Okay, so that's mistake number one. What is mistake number two? Mistake number 2 is the massive expansion of the welfare state. Lyndon Johnson created what was known as the Great Society. This was a massive welfare program, tons of public works programs, tons of handouts, tons of economic intervention into the life of Americans. Now, we just went over exactly why this program would have a higher impact on blacks. So saying that Black America was affected by the welfare program more than white America isn't racist. It's a statement of fact based on the conditions that the black community was just coming out of going into this era. So what happens when you create a massive welfare state? The first thing you do is you create multi-generational dependence. Now, there's study after study showing that that's the case, that welfare and public assistance programs don't elevate people out of poverty, but instead create multi-generational dependence. So that action took a large portion of the black community and made them government dependents. And that's a generational thing that gets passed down. That's just a fact of the matter. You can look at study after study after study on it. That's not necessarily what I want to focus on here. What I really want to focus on is the fact that at this point, we had a 24% non-marital birth rate in the black community. We had families that had been broken up. We had emasculated black men based on Jim Crow, based on slavery, all these things that had gone on prior. This was just another step at replacing the black man at the head of the black family. And look, it may sound sexist to say that the black man was no longer at the head of the black family, because now in 2020 we don't look necessarily at a man as the head of the household. But in the 1960s, that was certainly the case. So you take a group of people, a race within a nation, a minority group within a nation, and you have them functioning in a different way than the majority of the country is functioning. That's not a recipe for success. They are not a patriarchal society. At that time in America, and you could say we were patriarchal today, I don't want to get into that whole gender argument right now and gender roles and all that stuff. What I am saying is that at that time in America, we were very patriarchal. The man was the head of the house. He went out, he was the breadwinner, and that's not how the black community was functioning. And because they were functioning in a completely different way than the rest of the country, it's not unexpected at all that while the rest of the country enjoyed prosperity and increasing wealth, that the black family was not able to capture once again, they were not able to capture the momentum that was gained through the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. So while it was a unifying force while the movement was happening, once it was over, they were still left with all this legacy. They were still left with this high non-marital birth rate. Then you take a massive economic intervention into their lives, and you essentially replace the black man with government at the head of the black household, and the black family continued to dissolve, resulting in what is today, depending on what study you read, 70 to 77% of children born to black women are born into fatherless homes or absentee father homes. So even if you believe systemic racism exists, you can't have this. The numbers are unbelievable. The odds of criminality, the odds of educational failure, the odds of just every negative outcome you could ask for, every negative thing that you look at the black community and say, this is the problem. Every aspect of that can be traced right back to the fact that you have this massive non-marital birth rate in the black community. I think that what happened next in this country is probably the most detrimental thing that happened to black America. And that is this right here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked...
At this moment, we made a decision that we were going to start looking at drugs as the president of the time said, public enemy number one. And we are going to start directing major resources, both domestically and internationally, to fighting what they felt at the time was a horrible scourge on the American people. Now, it's very important to remember why, or to really analyze why this would be such a major impact on the black community as opposed to the white community. Imagine you're just coming out of a time of real systemic oppression, that the realistically racist attitudes at that time were still very prevalent in society. There were still major parts of the economy that, while you were legally allowed to participate in, you were still probably being cut off due to actual racism. And at this point, you are relatively poor. Your community is relatively poor. You've been forced into poverty for an extended period of time. And there's no question that when that happens and the hopelessness that surrounds that kind of a situation, there's no doubt that the hopelessness that surrounds that kind of a situation leads to illicit activity. There's no question about it. This isn't necessarily a bad character trait. This is a black father who doesn't know how he's going to support his family, is very distrustful of the system around him, and decides that maybe dealing drugs is a way in which to provide for his family. The bottom line is that there's no question that poverty leads to this kind of activity. And the poverty that the black people were suffering in the 60s and early 70s was absolutely related to our legacy of racism. So when we decided to declare a war on drugs, the black community was going to be very susceptible to all the actions that were being taken. Just like they were susceptible to the welfare state, they were going to be susceptible to a war on drugs. And the sad thing about this is, and the reason that I support the Libertarian Party, and the reason I think a lot of what Democrats are saying are very disingenuous, is because as we escalated the war on drugs, you can see Democrat support for this throughout the process. We know it. We know it's coming up in this election. We know it's going to be an issue. We know it's very clear, and because it's closer in history, it's very clear that Joe Biden helped co-author the '94 crime bill that was signed by President Clinton. But prior to that, the crime bill that Ronald Reagan signed doubled the prison population in just 8 years. The number of nonviolent drug offenders in prison went into the hundreds of thousands. I believe it was 50,000 nonviolent offenders in prison before that crime bill and over 300,000 after it. And here's a photo of Charlie Rangel, black leader for Harlem, getting ready to applaud Ronald Reagan signing that bill. The Libertarian Party, Joe Jorgensen as the Libertarian nominee for president, vehemently opposes the war on drugs, wants to decriminalize drugs, end the war on drugs, release nonviolent offenders, and return them to their communities. When we talk about the fatherless issue amongst the black community, how many fathers are sitting in prison right now that have been separated from their families because of this? We talk about family separation. That's an issue that keeps coming up. There's your family separation right there. So when we look back at the things that went on during the civil rights movement, immediately after the civil rights movement, immediately after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, we can look at the ignoring the Moynihan Report and not being able to address issues that were taking place in the black community at the time. Then we can look at the advent of the massive welfare state that Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law. But then the thing that is most impacting us today, and I believe the thing that is probably directly led to the death of George Floyd, is the war on drugs. The reason the police are constantly harassing black people isn't because they're racist. It's because they are trying to fight a war on drugs. They're pulling people over who fit a profile. Yes, they're racially profiling black people. Yes, black people are being racially profiled because they have higher rates of criminality. But this is a historical situation. This is a legacy issue of racism that put the black community in this position, and we have to be able to deal with that if we're going to end these problems. If we're going to, we have mass incarceration of a single race in our country, and it's based on that policy. If we had not intervened, even ignoring the Moynihan Report, even not intervening in the black family, if we had not created a massive welfare state, and we had not turned around and criminalized drugs and decided that we were going to ramp up enforcement, we're going to put more police on the street, and we were going to do all these things and change sentencing and create minimum sentences and all those things, it's very hard to believe that we would have a militarized police force hell-bent on engaging millions and millions of times per year with the civilian population, because the reason they're doing that is to fight that war on drugs. This is what has continued to destroy the black family. This is what has led to the mass incarceration of black people. And the Libertarian Party, presidential nominee Joe Jorgensen, is the only one who's actually willing to stand up and say we need to end this war on drugs completely. Not little piecemeal actions, not little tiny things. The Libertarian Party also happens to be the ones who want to eliminate the protection of qualified immunity for police officers. There's a lot of things that the Libertarian Party would do to help start creating a society that actually functions and is working towards some level of equality. But at the end of the day, if you're going to support a Democrat or a Republican and you march with Black Lives Matter, I'll say it before and I'll say it again, take your sign and go home. Because the only party that actually wants to create a system where black people aren't constantly being harassed by the police is the Libertarian Party. Now, we could disband police forces and we could pull the police back, and you're hearing that kind of conversation going on right now all across the country. But here's what's going to happen, and this is what happened last time. You pull the police back out of the black community. Over the last 2 years, violent crime in the black communities, particularly in large the inner cities, has started to steadily increase. That's going to hit. If we don't fix the war on drugs, if we don't fix the drug issue, we're going to pull the police back. We're going to have less enforcement. We're going to have less engagement by the police, which is a good thing. But if we don't fix the other issue, we're going to have, once again, crime starting to creep up. And we're going to have black leaders 10, 15, 20 years from now forgetting the lessons that we should be learning right now. And once again, just like they did in the 80s, just like they did in the 90s, asking for government help to send in the police to quell the incredible amount of violence that is going to sweep back into that community. That's what was happening in the late 70s and the early 80s as a result of the war on drugs. And as we pull police back out of the black communities now, that is what's going to happen again. We have to fix that problem or we're not doing anybody any good. So when we look back at the black community and what's going on today with George Floyd and all these other things, we have to have a solid historical perspective of how we got here. And if you believe that the government today is systemically and inherently racist, that's fine. But I would ask you in my comments section to tell me what you would want to change that I haven't addressed today and what specific things need to be done to get us to the right place. Because this is a conversation that's very important that we need to have, and it's not going anywhere. So again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I put a lot into this particular video. I hope you like, I hope you subscribe. If you feel like the message rings true, please share this amongst your friends and use it as a tool to start a conversation. Even if you don't necessarily agree with me, use it as a tool to start a conversation, because if we as a nation don't start having better conversations, we're never going to get anywhere. So I appreciate it once again. And thanks for tuning in. And as always, I will see you next time.